Welcome to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. You know, Germany's finance ministry has denied reports that it's preparing a third bailout for Greece. Duh! Of course not. No, there will be no third bailout for Greece. Bailouts are so last decade. This is the age of the bail-in. By the time this is over, the bandits, banksters, and brokers will have taken all that you've got. No dollar, euro, yen, or drachma will be left behind. And inflation, deflation, and confiscation will take every last nickel and dime.
That's right, Max. I believe it will. And in fact, the Bank of England did an online hashtag tweet operation where you were allowed to send them questions. And apparently somebody sent them a question about quantitative easing and called it evil. Well, here is the Bank of England tweet, hashtag AskBOE, QE not evil, they told Microman 101, has helped to support economy and protect jobs. So they, of course, received some responses to this. QE is evil and you are the devil, says grumpy old dude. And then after that, we see Life Master said, no, it's helped to support a corrupt banking system and push people further into poverty. So there you have it. The Bank of England says QE, quantitative easing, is not evil.
Well, you know, they say over there at the Bank of England that they're tying their monetary policy to jobs. But there is no connection, really, between these two, other than the fact that the quantitative easing is forcing wages down as part of a deflationary crash that the UK now finds itself in. And by deflation, I mean that the bond market in the UK is imploding from within. We see this in the banking sector. HSBC, Barclays, Royal Bank of Scotland, and Lloyds, remember, they imploded in a deflationary implosion in 2008. Just because the Bank of England now, they say they're saving their economy, they're misstating the facts here. They're keeping zombie banks afloat, even though the real economy is experiencing a deflation in savings rate, a deflation in wages, and a crunch in purchasing power. So the Bank of England is lying. You could say that they're evil in that they support financial terrorism, as I've said before.
Of course, we've seen that electric and gas prices are skyrocketing here. And last week, David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the UK, told citizens and, well, subjects of the UK that he's told them to switch from British gas because they raised their prices by 9.2%. Well, npower, another big energy provider here, just raised their gas prices by 11.1% and their energy prices by 9.3%. So if you had switched into npower, you would be shocked to learn that you're about to get an even bigger rise than what British Gas was offering. But also this headline today, frenzied London property market sees house prices jump 10% in just a month. This is up from 2% per month throughout the summer. So per month, that's 2%, 10% per month. Remember, wages in the UK are increasing at less than 2% per year. So here you see the effects of inflation. We have inflation, deflation, and confiscation. This is inflation, robbing the poor, robbing those on having to work for a living. Of course, if you can extract equity from your home, you're doing very well, because apparently the average house price in London made about £50,000 just this past month.
Well, these prices, particularly in energy, are not the result of inflation per se, but the collapse of competition in the UK.
Yeah.
So you have an oligopoly or duopoly, and they're colluding. The energy companies in this country are colluding to jack prices higher, and they're not allowing for free market competition. In the case of house prices moving up, here you have those four too-big-to-fail banks colluding to channel money from the Bank of England into speculation. 30 to 40 to 45% of UK's economy is real estate speculation. Another 40% is financial speculation. Only 13% is actually small to medium enterprises. And if you talk about inflation, that would mean wages would be going up. That's what inflation includes. But wages are going down. So it's not inflation in the sense of the classic sense of what inflation means. You've got deflation, you've got money printing, which is fueling an entrenched kleptocracy and oligopoly, which is stealing money from the public in several ways, through monopoly pricing on energy and food, by confiscating wealth through bail-ins and other sorts of government imposed schemes like the Help to Buy scheme. And then you have loss of wages due to the fact that the government's over in China doing deals with the Chinese after having stripped all the jobs here and giving all the jobs to China.
Well, of course, the energy companies are being sold off to China as well. So, of course, what happened was Margaret Thatcher privatized British gas, and now it's all those sort of companies are being sold to national companies, whether it's in Germany, France, or China, state-owned companies that are now buying up.
This is really the ironic bit of it here, is that the Royal Mail was sold off. It was privatized.
Yeah.
Huge buyer of Royal Mail stock are the public pension funds in Germany and other countries from the public welfare sector that will be getting the money that Britons spend on mail and higher and higher and higher, and then the public pension funds of these countries will get the benefit of having a utility like Royal Mail. Sure, a few people made a few private pops in the stock. It was up a few percentage points and they made a few quick bucks. But within 2 years, the turnover of that float will be such. The British people would vomit out their profits on the street within a year or so, having a whoop-de-doo party time. But that huge income-producing asset will be in the hands of a foreign government who will then be charging British people extra for the luxury of having their mail sorted and delivered at the expense of themselves.
Well, actually, another big buyer was the sovereign wealth funds of the Gulf nations, of Qatar, of Kuwait, of all those regions. They were buying up the Royal Mail. So, but you know, here the tweeter responded to the Bank of England and said that they were pushing people further into poverty. So I want to look at what quantitative easing has done around the world. Body parts for sale by desperate U.S. workers. The Bloomberg article about this, the same headline on Businessweek, they say bodies double as cash machines. So this is what's happening in the United States thanks to quantitative easing, where they're also saying we're targeting jobs and giving people jobs. Well, in all but 2 quarters since the beginning of 2011, hair, eggs, and kidney have been among the top 4 autofill results for the Google search query, I want to sell my ... So the sale of kidneys, however, is illegal in the United States. That people even explore it indicates that there's still a lot of people worried about their financial outlook, says Nicholas Colas, a chief market strategist at New York-based ConvergeX, who tracks off-the-grid economic indicators. This is very much unlike, he says, every other recovery we've ever had.
Right, because it's not an economic recovery where people are getting jobs and wages are going higher, and there's a symbiotic relationship between bankers and workers and other parts of the economy that aggregate themselves into a working whole. You've got one predatory monopolist, the banking sector and the energy sector, forcing the Bank of England to flood the market with cash to the point where individuals, to make ends meet, have to sell their kidneys. And I'm sure that there'll be formal kidney exchanges. I'm sure that the NYMEX in New York will have a up and running kidney exchange, and you can buy and sell kidneys on that exchange. There'll be kidney futures, there'll be kidney derivatives, there'll be a huge market for body parts. But that's not a healthy sign. That's not a good economy if people are selling their body parts to afford heat that's being priced by a monopolist, that's being fed by a predatory psychopath, Mark Carney, over at the Bank of England.
Of course, Osborne was in China this past week, and he called the Brits second rate and that they should be more like China. But of course, in China, there's a huge body parts market, mostly from prisoners that have been executed. In the U.S., they said if they did have a formal kidney market, and they're suggesting they should do, that it would be the average kidney would go for $15,200. But they said that people most likely to accept payment for a kidney tend to be younger and healthy, coming from modest means, which of course is who is being penalized in every sector of the economy, whether they're being all these top-up fees that became huge fees for college, all the 10% rise in house prices here in 1 month in London is forcing out the young. It's benefiting the old as wealth transfer from the young who now have to sell their kidneys to even get on the property ladder.
Right, if you're under 25 years old, you're being bred for body parts. I mean, let's be honest. That's your use to society. Get yourself into so much debt by buying consumer garbage from high-tech companies until you have to use your organs to be transplanted to some geriatrics who are making out like bandits, having done deals. Oh my God, I just saw a vision.
Well, I was just thinking that we used to have these films back in the 70s about like Logan's Run, where we took the body parts of the old people, not the young people. Now it's...
Yeah, why that makes no sense. Why would you want an old, crusty, dusty liver? Of course, George Osborne, he tried to sell his brain in China. He couldn't even get a pork bun for it. I think $5 is all anyone wanted for George Osborne's brain.
The scheme of inflation, deflation, confiscation. Now we're seeing confiscation here. Channel 4 News reports RBS accused of seizing small business assets and selling them at knockdown prices to an RBS subsidiary. So because of the mis-selling of swaps, remember RBS is paying for those mis-selling of swaps right now. Well, during that time, they also seized the property of customers, business customers, at knockdown prices. They said it was an auction, but it was actually to their own subsidiary. So they used the case, Channel 4 News found this case of a man who owned a property. They bought it for £500,000, the subsidiary, and sold it within a few weeks for £1 million on the open market.
Right, RBS, predatory monopolist. They were bailed out by the state. They were not forced to atone for their financial terrorism. So you're feeding them, you're saying, we like your terrorism. Now they're going after the small to medium enterprises in the UK. They're chopping them up, they're selling them for parts. They're the zombie banks that are marauding the landscape. They're out of control, they're zombie terrorists, and the state funds them. So again, the youth are being raised for body parts and consumption and to get in over their head with loans that they can't possibly afford. When this real estate market crashes within 18 months, then everyone who is getting on the so-called property ladder, they'll be forced to sell at knockdown prices.
The subsidiary is called West Register, but I want to move on to this final headline here about Bitcoin because, of course, Bitcoin is unconfiscatable, essentially, because unless they could crack your brain wallet, which they can't, then they can't take it. So John Matonis, looking at the Dread Pirate Roberts story, the Silk Road confiscation, he says, if your online wealth cannot be robbed by common bandits or government officials, then the world truly has a digital money worth paying attention to. Now, the reason why I bring this up is and why it's so important that it can't be confiscated is we saw in China the announcement that Baidu, the largest internet company, would be accepting Bitcoin. And we also saw on Friday world's third largest Chinese Bitcoin exchange hit by 100 gigabyte per second DDoS attack. And experts looked at it and said, whoever did this didn't care how much money they were losing because they were spending a lot of money to do this attack. And it reminds me of the attacks on gold and silver, that somebody who doesn't care about losing money, somebody who could drop $650 million on gold.
Yeah, well, get yourself to Bitcoin because it's unconfiscatable, as you point out. The price now is being set in China, where the price of Bitcoin has doubled in the last few weeks post Silk Road. And it's going to, as I say, my interim target is $350 now. My longer term target, of course, is $100,000 per Bitcoin. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Rex.
Stay tuned for the second half. A whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to go to Dublin and speak with Professor Constantin Gurdgiev. Welcome back to the Keiser Report, Constantin.
Delighted to be with you, Max.
All right, Constantin, you tweeted that Greece is on the verge of bailout 3.0. The German finance minister denies this. Who is right?
Well, I mean, unfortunately, it's not German finance minister who is right, and it's not me who is right. Reality is Troika has left Greece and currently is sitting back, waiting for the Greek authorities to come back with a credible plan to plug the deficit. The deficit is estimated between 3.8 billion to 4.4 billion for the next year, 11.2 billion over the next 2 years. It depends whom you trust, whether you trust IMF, who is usually a bit more on the money, or you trust the European authorities. Either way, there is certainly a gap there, and it has to be plugged.
Isn't it more likely that what we'll see in Greece will be bail-ins, like we saw in Cyprus? And what would a bail-in look like in the context of Greece?
From the very beginning of the Greek crisis, it was very clear that either the country will have to go through a massive financial repression, both including the bail-ins of the depositors and the bondholders and the likes in the private sector, or there have always been a very much easier way, cheaper solution, which would have involved some sort of what is known as official sector participation, or in other words, other lenders such as the ECB, IMF, and the rest of them taking a hit. But of course, we know that the official sector is refusing to participate in bailing out Greece. And as a result of that, we're hurtling very rapidly towards a situation where the ordinary depositors, let alone large-scale depositors, will be bailed in. Most likely, I suspect that in the next few years, we're going to see that anyways materializing in Greece, whether this third bailout is going to be unveiled or not, because it's quite clear that when the country faces 175% of its GDP in terms of government debt alone, when the private sector debts are massive, when the banks are reliant on government bonds in terms of to sustain on balance sheets, when the banks are going to the ECB all of the time to borrow, it's very clear that sooner or later the billions of ordinary depositors will come in.
I mean, you talk about the official sector and how they are never asked to take any kind of a haircut or any kind of a loss. But Constantin, isn't it the case where the official sector has more or less caused the problem as a way to fund themselves? In other words, 5 or 6 years ago, the IMF was almost bankrupt. It wasn't until the Greece problem came around and the Irish problem came around that suddenly the IMF found itself back in play. But the IMF funds itself on the wholesale debt market in ways that are not available to Greece. So you have a very asymmetric relationship here. The IMF and the official sector, as you call it, is basically picking on Greece, picking on Ireland, picking off assets in a predatory nature. They're not there to help these countries. They're here to ransack these countries. Am I wrong?
To some extent, you are right, in the sense that the IMF have certainly expanded dramatically its mandate and its lending in recent years. Part of that is driven by the crisis. Part of that is driven by the fact that the IMF has already pushed before the crisis for expansion of its lending mandate and lending capacity. So what the irony of ironies that happened about 3 years ago is that IMF expanded the base of which they can lend by increasing the country's contributions to the IMF fund. And as a result of that, Ireland, which was going into the bailout, was obliged to pay in several billion euros into the IMF fund to fund it. The same with Greece. So we have the bailed out countries which actually contributing to have capital buffers, if you want. But yes, in general, it's less so prevalent in the case of the IMF, more prevalent in the case of the European authorities, whereby the bail-ins happened for the economies themselves, like the peripheral economies of Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Greece, and to some extent Italy, where the bail-ins are happening through the lending to the sovereigns in order to recover, if you want, some of the assets in the private sector. Most pronounced case was, of course, in Cyprus and in Ireland. And in Ireland, in Irish case, we literally paid off the bondholders in Irish banks using the money borrowed by the exchequer from the Troika. So in a sense, and now we're trying to exit that bailout so that the same lenders whom we bailed out in the first place are going to lend us again.
So they've reinflated all the moral hazard, as it's called, has been refinanced for another round of predatory behavior. So let's talk about Ireland for a second. We're told it's going to, as you mentioned, they're going to exit the bailout soon. When and how? And where will they regain their economic sovereignty? Will they regain their economic sovereignty as the government is claiming? Can you speak on this a bit?
Of course, yes. Let's take it in stages. First of all, the Irish government has promised that by December 15th, Ireland will so-called exit the bailout. What they mean by exiting the bailout is entirely different from the from the bailout that Iceland has achieved. When Ireland exits the bailout, comes mid-December this year, it basically means that we have run out of the road borrowing from the Troika. There isn't any money left to borrow in the Troika pot, and as a result of that, Ireland is simply exiting by not asking for another bailout. Now, going from that right away, you can see the problem with the idea, with the thesis that we will regain our independence, our fiscal independence. First of all, Ireland is a part of the Fiscal Compact Treaty. We ratified that treaty. We passed that treaty through the referendum. And as a result of that, Ireland is under what's known as the two packages of legislation, the EU legislation, which affects the very significant and stringent oversight of the budgetary dynamics and fiscal dynamics in the member states. And this is the so-called two-pack and six-pack legislation. In particular, under the two-pack legislation, any country that still owes money to the Troika and has not repaid at least 75% of the borrowings from the Troika will be subject to the enhanced oversight by not Troika anymore, but by European authorities. So in a sense, Ireland is regaining its independence from Troika by going what the Russians would call dvoika. In other words, instead of three parties overseeing its performance, there will be two parties overseeing its performance, the European Union and the ECB. Now, when you look at the composition of the Troika, throughout the whole crisis, since the beginning of the bailout and onwards, and even before the bailout, during the beginning of the banking crisis in Ireland, the IMF played the most benign role. in the entire combination of lenders, in the sense that IMF, for example, was willing to delay some of the adjustments and give Irish authorities some breathing space to sustain some growth in the economy. IMF also was focusing more on longer-term structural reforms, while the ECB and the European Commission are focusing on very quick attempts to fix the deficit problems alone without the structural reforms as such. So as a result of that, in a sense, Ireland going out of the bailout will be throwing overboard the only support it has in the Troika.
All right, quick question. What percentage of able-bodied youth over the past 5 years in Ireland has left?
Well, we're having the immigration right now. We don't know exactly the breakdown in terms of the youth themselves, but what we do know is that the immigration has accelerated from being net recipient of immigrants into Ireland in 2006, 2007, and before that. So before the crisis, we were bringing people in at a higher rate than we were shipping them out. Since the onset of the crisis, we have dramatic rise in terms of net emigration. There was 80,000 people who emigrated last year out of the country with 4.8 million population. That's a significant amount. But what's more troubling now is that even in the early years of the crisis, majority of immigrants were returning migrants from the accession states, such as Poland, for example, Slovakia, Baltic states, and so forth, who lost their jobs in Ireland and were returning back to their home countries or moving somewhere else in Europe. About 3 years ago, the switch occurred, whereby now the dominant share of people emigrating on the net are the Irish people themselves. In addition to it, in the last 2 years, we are tracking very significant outflows of younger people who are highly educated and sometimes even have jobs, who live in Ireland simply because they see no opportunity for their future advancement, their future careers, their future growth. Our Irish authorities say that this is a lifestyle choice. In a sense, yes, it is, as we usually joke here in Ireland, a lifestyle choice. They choose to have a lifestyle rather than to have none of it whatsoever in the future.
All right, Constantine, while on a trade visit to China, the Chancellor here, George Osborne, called the UK a second-rate nation where the people have to start working like the Chinese. Do you agree?
No, I disagree. If you look actually at what's happening in China, is majority of China is moving towards working like the advanced economies are, by adding high value to their output, by having skills and relying on skills and innovation. Chinese economy is changing very dramatically right now internally. It's not visible to us from the outside as much, but what's happening there is you can see economies, the BRICS economies in general, shifting away from this commoditized production of what we call in economics widgets, generic stuff, basically, cheap teddy bears for the Western markets, and into production of the indigenously designed, developed, high-value added goods. Take manufacturers like Lenovo, for example, in China. That's a great example of that. Look at the automotive sector in China, which has gone over less than a decade from being able to produce only substandard quality cars to higher and higher quality cars and so forth. So it is very ironic that the Chancellor is talking about starting to resemble China. Perhaps what he's referencing more so is the ethos or ethics of workplace. And in some ways, yes, in social democracies around the world, we have dislearned quite often how to work hard. We have very high expectations. But that is very much overgeneralization as well, because if you look at, for example, economies like take Italy, Italian economy is effectively split into three parts. You have an administrative center in the center of Italy around Rome, Lazio region. You have a kind of more agricultural, high value added agricultural, I must add, but more agricultural and agrarian society out in the south. But when you look at the northern Italy, it is as efficient as Switzerland, it is as efficient as southern Germany and Austria. So there is a very high level of productivity, high level of activity, high aptitude, high quality aptitude, and very significant human capital accumulated there. The same with the UK. If you look at the areas of southern England, for example, areas around London and so forth, which sustain the UK economy overall, they contrasted by the what we would call welfare-dependent part of England, such as, for example, Northern Ireland and Wales, where there is a very high level of transfers from the rest of the UK into the budgetary dynamics, into the fiscal side, in order to sustain some sort of growth.
All right, so Osborne, if he wanted the value-added sector to expand, he would try to improve the education standards by not having things like top-up fees to get the education quotient higher and therefore increase that higher up on the food chain in terms of value added. So he's got it completely ass backwards, as one would expect from George Osborne. Now, we've got about 30 seconds left. I wanted to ask you about a new phrase that's been introduced to the world by China, de-Americanization. What does that mean? What are your thoughts on this? We've got about 30 seconds.
It has been a very long-standing dream around the world to have some sort of an alternative emergent to the U.S. dominance in terms of the investment flows and in terms of the trade flows, as well as the human capital flows around the world. I think this is unlikely to develop on the side of the China pushing for it or BRICS pushing for it. But sooner or later, American influence around the world is going to continue to decline, and will decline to the point where America is going to be, if you want, not a second power as such, but rather a power parallel or sharing in that power with other centers around the world, most likely regional centers such as Asia Pacific.
All right, Constantin Gurdgiev, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
And that's all the time we have for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser. I'd like to thank our guest, Constantin Gurdgiev. If you'd like to get in touch with us, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.